She closed the register, turned off the lights, and locked the door behind her. That was the last time anyone who loved her would hear her voice. For 25 years, a family sat with an open wound. A mother who kept her daughter's room exactly the way she left it. A community that never fully exhaled. And a killer who woke up every single morning, made coffee, went about his day, and believed he had gotten away with it. He almost did. This is the story of how one woman's life was taken in the span of a single evening, how an entire investigation went quiet for a quarter of a century, and how a breakthrough in science eventually walked detectives straight to the front door of the man responsible. But before we get to the answer, we have to sit inside the question, because that's where this family lived for longer than most people can imagine. And that question starts on an April night in a small Massachusetts town, in a parking lot that should have been safe, beside a car that never moved. Lisa was the kind of person a community doesn't realize it depends on until she's gone. She was 24 years old, a teacher's aide by day, and she'd picked up a second job at a local card shop, not because she was careless with money, but because she cared about her future. She was building something. She had plans. The second job was supposed to be temporary, just something to help her get ahead. She was young, organized, responsible. The kind of person who calls when she's running late. On the evening of April 15, 1992, she finished her shift at the card store in Agawam, Massachusetts. She did everything right. She went through the closing routine, counted out, shut down, locked up. That part of the night was completely ordinary. There was no argument, no strange phone call, no warning that anything was about to go wrong. But when she walked out of that shop and into the parking lot, something happened. Nobody saw it. Nobody heard anything that would later hold up as a clear account of what took place in those minutes. What investigators would eventually piece together was grim and deliberate. This was not a random moment of rage. What happened to Lisa in that parking lot was calculated. Someone had been watching. Someone had chosen her. Her car was still there the next morning. That's what made it undeniable. Lisa would never have left that car. She was not someone who disappeared voluntarily. She was not someone in crisis. She had a life, a family, a job she showed up to every day. When her car sat untouched in that lot and she didn't come home, the people who knew her understood immediately that something was terribly wrong. And they were right. 3 days after Lisa disappeared, her body was found in a wooded area not far from where she had last been seen. She had been sexually assaulted and stabbed. She was 24 years old. There is no way to soften that. There is no framing that makes it easier to absorb. A 24-year-old woman who locked a door and walked to her car was murdered. Her family had spent 3 days hoping, bargaining, praying, and then the call came. The investigation launched immediately. Detectives canvassed the area. They collected evidence from the scene. They processed what they found. They had physical evidence, biological evidence, that could theoretically identify who had done this. In 1992, that was significant. DNA testing existed, though it was still relatively new in criminal investigations. Investigators held on to that biological evidence carefully, treating it as the key to a case they were sure they would close. They started with the obvious circles: people who knew Lisa, people who had been seen around the shop, people with relevant histories. They interviewed. They followed leads. They worked it hard in those early weeks and months. And then, slowly, the leads dried up. Not because detectives stopped caring. Not because the case was deprioritized. But because in 1992, with the tools available at that time, the biological evidence they held could only tell them so much. Without a suspect to match it against, it was a lock with no key. They had proof of what had been done. They just didn't have a name. The case went cold. Going cold doesn't mean going away. For Lisa's family, the case never went anywhere. Her mother never stopped. There are families in situations like this who eventually find a way to create distance, not from love, but from survival. And then there are families who simply refuse to let the case become the past. Lisa's family was the latter. Every year, the anniversary came. Every year, her name was still out there, kept alive by people who needed the world to remember that she had existed, that she had mattered, that whoever had done this had not successfully erased her. Law enforcement didn't forget either. Cold case units exist precisely because investigators understand that evidence doesn't expire. A case that can't be solved today might be solvable in 5 years, in 10, in 20, because science doesn't stand still. The biological evidence collected from the scene in 1992 was maintained. Preserved. Waiting. And in the years that followed, the science caught up. The development of DNA genealogy technology, the same technology that allows ordinary people to trace their ancestry across centuries, turned out to be one of the most powerful investigative tools ever handed to cold case detectives. The principle is relatively straightforward, even if the execution requires painstaking work. When you have a DNA sample from an unknown person, you can run it against public genealogy databases. If any of that person's distant relatives have submitted their own DNA to one of those databases, you start to see partial matches. You can then build a family tree, working forward and backward through generations, until you identify a pool of possible descendants who fit the timeline and geography of the case. It's not a fingerprint match. It's a family map. And in this case, that map eventually led somewhere. Investigators working the Ziegert case submitted the preserved biological evidence to this kind of genealogical analysis. What came back wasn't an instant answer. It was a starting point, a branch of a family tree, a set of possible surnames, a framework to work within. Detectives then had to do what detectives have always done, follow the thread. They began constructing a family tree from those partial DNA matches. They identified relatives, traced lineages forward in time, and began narrowing the list of possible suspects. That process takes time. It requires cross-referencing public records, birth certificates, death records, marriage records. It requires eliminating people who couldn't fit, wrong age, wrong location, already deceased. And it requires focus. Because the person you're looking for might not appear anywhere in any existing criminal database. They might have no record, no prior convictions, no reason to have ever been on law enforcement's radar. That was the case here. Gary Scarra was not someone detectives had ever looked at before. He was a local man, he had been in the area in 1992, he fit within the relevant geography, but there was nothing about him that had ever drawn attention. No prior arrests. No history of violence that investigators had documented. He had lived his life. He had existed within the same community where Lisa had existed. And for 25 years, no one had connected the two of them. The DNA did. Before any arrest was made, investigators had to make absolutely certain. In cold cases involving genealogical DNA work, the initial findings narrow the field, they don't close it. Detectives still need to confirm the biological match against an actual sample from the living suspect. This is typically done covertly, using what's called a discarded sample. Investigators follow the suspect, wait for him to discard something in a public space, a coffee cup, a cigarette, and retrieve it. The DNA from that discarded item is then tested against the crime scene evidence. When Scarra's sample came back as a match, the case that had been open for 25 years finally had its answer. He was arrested in 2017. 25 years after that parking lot. 25 years after Lisa's car sat untouched through the night while her family's world collapsed. 25 years of a family's grief, of community uncertainty, of an open wound that had never been allowed to close. He was convicted. In 2019, Gary Scarra was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But here's the thing that doesn't get talked about enough when these cases resolve, and this matters, so stay with me here. An arrest is not an answer to every question a family carries. When someone is convicted of a crime like this, there is a moment of something. Relief is the word people often use, but that's not quite right. It's more complicated than relief. It's acknowledgement. After 25 years of being told, effectively, by the silence of the case, that maybe the truth would never come, suddenly the truth is confirmed. And that confirmation is real. It matters enormously. But it doesn't undo the 25 years. It doesn't give back the anniversaries. It doesn't give back the graduations and the holidays and the Sunday dinners that happened with that empty chair at the table. It doesn't give back the energy her mother spent keeping Lisa's name alive, the exhaustion of never being able to fully grieve because the wound was still open. There is a particular kind of cruelty in a long cold case that isn't discussed enough. When someone is murdered and the killer is caught quickly, the family is still shattered, but they enter grief with the case resolved. They know who did it. The process of whatever limited form of justice the system offers begins. But when a case goes cold, the family is frozen. They can't move forward because they don't have the full picture. They can't fully grieve because the story isn't finished. They exist in a suspension, holding their daughter's memory, holding their outrage, holding their need for answers, for years. For decades. Lisa Ziegert's family held that for 25 years. That number deserves to sit in the room for a moment. 25 years. A child born the year Lisa was killed would have been finishing their college degree by the time an arrest was made. Entire careers, entire families, entire chapters of human life passed by while Lisa's mother waited for someone to tell her who had taken her daughter. That is the weight of a cold case. That is what the statistics don't capture. The technology that solved this case, investigative genealogy, has since been used to solve dozens of cold cases across the country. The ethical debates around it are real and ongoing. There are questions about privacy, about consent, about the use of databases that individuals submitted to for personal ancestry research, never imagining their data might one day be used in a criminal investigation. Those debates matter. They deserve serious attention and careful policy decisions. But here, in this case, the outcome is what it is. A man who abducted and murdered a 24-year-old woman, who walked away from that parking lot and returned to his ordinary life, who had 25 years in which he apparently believed the past would stay buried, that man is now in prison for the rest of his life. And Lisa Ziegert's family finally has the full picture. There is one more layer of this case that doesn't get enough attention, and it speaks to something broader than the Ziegert case specifically. It speaks to how we as a society handle the women who go missing and the women who are killed, particularly when those cases go cold. Lisa was a young woman working a second job. She was responsible, she was careful, she was doing everything society tells young women to do to stay safe. She was working a legitimate job, she was closing up properly, she was in a parking lot of a business in a town that felt familiar. There was no moment where anyone could reasonably point and say she had been careless. She had done nothing wrong. She was killed anyway. And then, for 25 years, the case existed on the margins, sustained primarily by the relentless effort of her family and the investigators who refused to let it become fully buried. The case only resolved because of a combination of factors that don't exist in every cold case: preserved biological evidence, the emergence of genealogical DNA technology, investigators who pursued the genealogy angle aggressively, and a functioning database of civilian DNA contributions that happened to include distant relatives of the perpetrator. Remove any one of those factors, and the case might still be cold today. That's not a criticism of law enforcement in this particular case. The investigators who eventually solved this worked it diligently across decades. It's a recognition of how many other cold cases, with different evidence profiles, with different resource allocations, with different technological luck, remain open. There are families right now sitting where Lisa's family sat in 1993, in 1998, in 2005. Waiting. Frozen. Not knowing. Some of them will get the call. Some of them won't. What Lisa's case ultimately demonstrates, beyond the specific details of the crime or the conviction, is the persistence of truth. Not in a sentimental way, but in a practical, almost stubborn way. The evidence was there from the beginning. The biological material was collected and preserved in 1992 by investigators who understood its value even when the technology to fully utilize it didn't yet exist. They didn't discard it. They held on to it, transferred it through chain of custody across a quarter of a century, and eventually handed it to a generation of investigators who had new tools. That chain, that deliberate, unglamorous act of evidence preservation, is what made the resolution possible. Not a dramatic confession. Not a witness who finally came forward. Not a dramatic turn of events. Just preserved biological material and scientists who developed new methods to use it. And the relentlessness of Lisa's family, who never allowed her name to become a statistic. There are people who read stories like this and come away focused on the perpetrator, on what kind of person does something like this, on what psychology produces a man who can take a life and then return to normalcy for 25 years. Those are legitimate questions, and forensic psychology has frameworks for engaging with them. But the more important story here isn't about him. It's about her. Lisa Ziegert was 24 years old. She worked with children. She took a second job not out of desperation but out of ambition and practicality. She was someone people depended on and someone who showed up. She was a daughter, a friend, a colleague. She had a future that she was actively building on the evening of April 15, 1992. That future was taken from her in a parking lot by a man she almost certainly didn't know. A man who saw her not as a person but as a target. A man who thought, for 25 years, that he had successfully erased her. He was wrong. Because here we are, decades later, saying her name. Her case is studied, referenced, used to demonstrate the power of investigative genealogy, used as evidence in policy debates about cold case methodology. Her case helped shape how investigators approach biological evidence preservation. Her case is taught. A man who wanted to erase her instead ensured she'd be remembered. The conviction of Gary Scarra in 2017, and his sentencing to life without parole in 2019, closed a legal chapter. But if you ask the people who loved Lisa whether closure is the right word for what they feel, most of them will tell you it isn't. Closure implies that a door shuts completely, that the weight lifts, that things return to a state of equilibrium. That's not what happens. What happens is that one specific question, the most urgent question, the one that keeps you awake at 3 in the morning for 25 years, gets answered. The rest of it, the grief, the longing, the altered shape of your family's life, the years you spent frozen, that doesn't go anywhere. It becomes something you carry differently, but you still carry it. There's a version of justice that the legal system can offer and a version it can never touch. The courts handled the part they could handle. The rest belongs to a family's private experience, and that belongs only to them. What we can do, what anyone outside that family can do, is refuse to let the story become background noise. Refuse to let Lisa Ziegert become a footnote in a genealogy technology demonstration. Acknowledge that behind the forensic science, behind the cold case statistics, behind the investigative methodology discussion, there was a 24-year-old woman who locked a door at the end of a Tuesday shift and never made it home. Her name was Lisa Ziegert. She was a teacher's aide. She took care of children. She worked hard. She made plans. She deserved to see them through. If you've watched this far, there's something worth leaving you with, not as a dramatic final note, but as a genuine question to sit with. We talk a lot about solved cases as success stories. And in the narrowest sense, yes, a conviction after 25 years is a success. The science worked. The investigators persisted. The system, slowly and imperfectly, delivered something. But the 25 years don't disappear from the accounting. The measure of a justice system isn't only in the cases it eventually solves. It's also in the speed, the resources, the prioritization, the preservation of evidence before better tools arrive. It's in whether families like Lisa's have access to the support they need while they wait. It's in whether cold cases receive consistent investigative attention even when they're not generating headlines. There are hundreds of families sitting in the same suspended grief that Lisa's family endured. Some of their cases have preserved biological evidence. Some of them will benefit from the next generation of forensic technology. Some of them are waiting for the same kind of breakthrough this case eventually received. What they need, in the meantime, is for us to keep saying the names. Keep insisting that the cases matter. Keep the pressure on the systems and the institutions to preserve evidence, fund cold case units, and treat every victim as someone whose story deserves resolution, not just the ones that happen to have the right evidence at the right technological moment. Lisa's case got there. Not because it was special, because people refused to let it go. That refusal matters. It matters in this case, and it matters in every case still waiting for its answer.